Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the 2004 movie The Punisher. So, this film ultimately is a really fairly interesting film, and the reason why I have to say The Punisher 2004 is because previously there was a Dolph Lundgren Punisher version movie that ultimately I don't know I've seen really the light of day, but it's out there, as well as a David Hasselhoff Nick Fury movie. So I have to say The Punisher 2004. Uh, Also, when looking at it, this movie had a sequel that doesn't exactly tie to this film. We end up having to where the Punisher Warzone movie ultimately was a movie that Thomas Jane was seemingly supposed to do that movie, but he was doing The Mist instead during that time period. So we end up having to just recast that movie and go a seemingly origin wise kind of the same approach. But it's a movie that kind of goes into a much more dark and grittier approach because it's a Marvel Knights approach. Kind of like with Ghost Rider and Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance. It's kind of into that Marvel Knights approach, which ultimately I liked both iterations. I like the fact, like the main reason why I was so appeased or having an appeal of this movie is because the Punisher has been known to have seemingly several different approaches and stuff along those lines, even to the point where the Punisher had been a war machine at some point. He had been possessed by Doctor Strange in one story. We ultimately have several different kind of approaches to this same character, and in this movie it's a much more grounded approach, which I can really appreciate, where in like Spider-Man the animated series in the 90s, we end up having to wear ultimately like the Punisher has like a jetpack and a battle van and all these kind of crazy gadgets that ultimately seem very absurd, where this movie is so much more grounded because ultimately when hearing the featurette, like the comic books at that time were making Punisher a very grounded character, so they kind of adapted that into this movie, which I can really appreciate. So, if anything, letting everybody know that this movie also has a director's cut. Uh, this, along with Daredevil, the Ben Affleck movie, that also had a director's cut where the scenes don't really quite matter for the Daredevil movie. I think for the director's cut, I honestly think that that approach actually enhances the movie a little bit. We end up having to where Jimmy Weeks, Frank Castle's partner at a certain extent in this movie, ultimately is to be more tied into the story in the director's cut, and we ultimately find out how exactly the Saint family had gotten the information that they did, and where ultimately in the theatrical release or in the movie's release, they end up kind of quickly getting to that, much more so than in the director's cut. So going into this movie, I really like the fact that, yeah, you can kind of boil down really the Punisher as just a Batman-ish like character with military like tactics, or ultimately marine like tactics, because ultimately the director's cut will tell you that as well. Here's my thing though. I really like the fact that we have a guy that mostly from at a certain point in this movie to the very end, he is very intimidating and he is seemingly unstoppable once he has a goal set in mind, which ultimately that is the one thing that I like about this character, is that he's basically unstoppable when he's like, I'm going to do this, and I don't care if ultimately I end up getting stabbed in the chest or anything along those lines. Uh, Speaking of which, I hope I'll eventually get to that point in this review about somebody getting stabbed in the chest for realsies in this movie. Because, yeah, somebody very tall, big and tall, ended up getting stabbed for real in this movie by accident. So, going into here, so we end up having it to where Frank, because origin story is to be thrusted in a place where he is just having to really and truly drinking his way into finding his finding his path. Like, he's a very demon in a bottle-ish like character that at the end of the day is either trying to figure out how to die in one way or the other, either by the bottle or by reasonably getting killed by someone, uh, going too far, and so on and so forth. So, if anything, I think there is there is quite a poetic justice that goes on in this movie, and I ultimately can appreciate this movie for delivering that. But I can also, like, there's some lines here and there where when you have it, Frank Castle doesn't say much in this movie, but when he does actually talk, it's like you're just glued to the screen because anything that he's saying is really either intriguing, important, or just like poetic justice throughout most of this. So that's ultimately what I can overall just like about this movie. And so let's go into the spoilers because ultimately we've already crossed our 5 minute like approach. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we open up on the very beginning of this movie. I'm not going to open up in the very director's cut way. So if you're looking for that, I apologize. Because ultimately, there's some scenes in there that ultimately are just a little bit different than the theatrical cut. So hopefully, no one will hold that against me. So we open with this movie because the director's cut, black and white military scene that was animated in. Interestingly enough. So, anyways, beginning of this, we end up having to where we have two guys who is to be Mickey Duca and ultimately John Saint, I believe. Uh, so we end up having, because twins, we end up having to where both Mickey and John end up going to a deal to talk to a character called Otto Creed. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Mickey is giving us the backstory of a character that won't really last very long in this movie. But it kind of gives us a backstory of not only a character that won't be in this movie for very long, but then also who Frank Castle is, because it's one and the same person. We end up having Mickey giving John information about a guy named Otto Creed, which ultimately is actually Frank Castle's character. Ultimately, we have Mickey mentioning like that he speaks several languages and all the things that he's been able to accomplish, so on and so forth. Ba 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 ba. Moving on. So we end up having them go meeting Otto Creed, and ultimately Otto Creed is to say, like, hey, my boss does not like new faces, and you're showing me a new face. Like, what's going on here? And ultimately Mickey's like, hey, like, this guy's fine, trust me. And so all of a sudden we are to all of a sudden be ambushed by police officers. Everybody's going running amok, and we end up having to where Otto Creed ends up pulling a gun out and is like, hey, like, he brought his friends. He like like he brought his police officer, like this is a stick up and so on and so forth. So Frank ends up starting to wave his gun around, and we have it to where the police officers end up lighting him up with bullets, killing him. We end up having to where accidentally uh, John had also been had been freaked had kind of freaking out, and he didn't want to go to jail. So ultimately, he is to end up having a bullet within his body as well, because there had been some shootout of sorts. So we end up having it to ultimately Mickey is to get arrested, and all the other bodies have been hauled off. So we end up having to ultimately that the FBI is going and seemingly going to a separate location to get all their evidence together, kind of get to a place of secrecy, and so we end up having to where the body bag that Frank Castle or Otto Creed was in had been opened to otherwise have it to where, okay, Otto Creed is now Frank Castle. We end up having to where Frank is to have had a wire and had blood pellets that ultimately had showcased that yeah, he died. He died for fake rubber bullets and so on and so forth. So we end up having to where ultimately Frank is running off to go and desperately need a change of clothes so that way he could get the heck out of there. So we end up finding out that this case is Frank's last case. That ultimately he is going to retire, and so we end up having to where uh, his partner Jimmy Weeks ultimately is to like give him a gold watch and send him on his way. We ultimately have it to where in the director's cut, Jimmy Weeks ultimately is the guy that ultimately goes and tells the Saints every little bit of information about who Otto Creed really is, who is actually Frank Castle. Because we end up finding out that Jimmy Weeks is a really bad gambler, and we end up having to where the Saints end up taking advantage of that um, with the guys that are to otherwise be in this movie as well, which ultimately I don't know the name of, because heaven forbid I actually know. Yeah, yeah, I won't know that. Um, but they're ultimately, I guess, Cuban. I guess. Anyways, moving on. So I don't know. I could be wrong about that whole thing. So going on here. So we end up having it to where Frank is to go home, and we end up finding out that seemingly Frank is basically moving away to I think London, and we ultimately have it to where his son is kind of very disappointed that they're moving away yet again. And we ultimately have it to where Frank ultimately says it's like, well, there's a whole reason why I had to move away, and when you become older, I'll tell you that reason. So we end up having to where also Frank is also talking about a dog named Buck that no matter how many times you threw a ball at him, the dog could catch it. Like it's a really interesting story that kind of just gives a backstory to these characters to kind of have like a kind of a tie to them being here and so on. It's really interesting. So we end up having it to where the family is to uh, go and have a family reunion that is ultimately in some beach like environment. I don't know exactly where it is, but so I guess they are to go to this beach like location before going off and living in the home of which that they are to live. So we end up having it to where while that is going on, we end up having to where Howard Saint, ultimately John Travolta's character, is to go and identify his son's body, ultimately mentioning that when his son was a little boy, he had to like help him tie his tie, and now he has to get him a new suit. So ultimately, we have it to where Howard Saint is ultimately asking uh, the police officer or the mortician or whoever there, like, who is Otto Creed and who is going to benefit off the deals of whatever he had done. And so we end up having to where ultimately they are not going to release that information, and we ultimately have it to where when Howard Saint and the Saint family are going to John's funeral, we end up having it to where Quentin Glass ends up coming to uh, Howard to ultimately give him that information about who uh, Otto Creed really was, and it was a detective named Frank Castle. We ultimately have it to where ultimately or Olivia Saint is ultimately going and telling Quentin Glass, like, kill him, kill his entire family. That is ultimately what she wants. So ultimately Quentin goes into going like, okay, sure. So like there's an interesting moment between Liv and between Quentin that gets really interesting within this movie, and I'll get to that. So we end up having to where I think Castle and his wife are to ultimately be in, I think, Barbados, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So we end up having to where they are to go to Barbados for this reunion and then to go off on their own. So we end up having to where ultimately Frank Castle Sr., which ultimately is Roy Schneider, which of course we know him from Jaws, and uh, really for me that is, or Sequest. So we end up having to where Frank Castle Sr. is to ultimately get everybody together to ultimately say it's like, yeah, like, it's great that we have like a whole family reunion here. It's been far too long. And ultimately we have to where Frank Castle Sr. goes into mentioning like that he's so happy that they're all here and proud that they're all here and everything like that. So we end up pushing on to ultimately have seemingly we end up having to where Frank Castle and his wife are ultimately to seemingly share a moment alone, and Frank is just so happy that he's finally just done with everything. Like, this was a long one, but the last one. And so we end up having his wife telling him this beautiful phrase where ultimately they are not lucky, they are blessed. And that is such a great sentiment, which ultimately I just really enjoyed about this film. So we end up having to where in the next morning, we end up having to where Frank and his wife is to look on their son, and because we end up having to where Frank ends up going and swimming with his son to ultimately see some guy that is otherwise at this like pier or something like that, and we end up having to where Frank Castle Sr. talks to Frank Castle Jr. About mentioning about who is the crazy person that ultimately swam all that way to meet that guy at that pier. Ultimately, they both looked at one another and pointed at one another. But anyways, Frank and his wife are ultimately to look at their son, and they're ultimately kind of pondering about having another kid. And we ultimately have the son waking up going, "What?" So we end up having to ultimately his son is to give Frank a seemingly gift of sorts, ultimately a retirement gift. We end up having to where Frank ends up going and giving uh, Frank a shirt that ultimately had said that the person that had given it to him like it wards off evil spirits, and ultimately he thought it was really spooky. Ultimately, when looking at it, like, I had seen this symbol being reused in the Bradley Cooper movie The Sniper, And ultimately, I'm like, okay, is that kind of a military symbol of sorts, or did they adapt that symbol? Or I'm just kind of interested. So we end up having to where Frank ends up taking this shirt and ultimately going like, like, did you know about this, wife? Ultimately, it's like, So we end up having to where ultimately Frank loves the gift, and ultimately they go off into, of course, more family reunion mode and so on and so forth. Where ultimately we have it to where Frank's wife and kid are to go off onto the beach to ultimately see a jellyfish of sorts, and Frank is to go off with his father to talk about his 911 Colts or something like that. His Colt guns. So we end up having to where Frank Jr. ultimately like talks about the guns and how ultimately he had to kind of adjust them and how they're not as good as they used to be. So while that is going on, we end up having it to where all of a sudden there is a sense or a hearing of gunfire. We end up finding out that Frank Castle's mother had died because we end up having to where the Saints men with Quentin Glass and Bobby Saint had arrived to go and assassinate this entire family with as many men as they could possibly have. So we end up having to where every single bit of Frank Castle's family is just getting sadly gunned down, and so we end up having to where Frank and Frank Senior are to do what they know best, go and find any kind of weapon that they could use to live as long as humanly possible, which ultimately they had seemingly shotguns of sorts. So whenever someone was to open the door, they were to open fire. We end up having to ultimately like this. This scene is really interesting between father and son, just survival. We end up pushing on to eventually have it to where Frank and Frank Sr. are to go further along into trying to find anybody that is left uh, of one, their family, but two, of the assassins. And so we end up having to where, sadly, that Frank Castle Sr. ends up dying before trying to kill a man. And we end up having uh, to where Frank Castle is to seemingly uh, once seemingly finding all of the carnage of seemingly his dad, which is a sad moment. He pushes on to eventually go into trying to find his wife and son. We end up having to where Maria and his son and Castle's son ends up trying as much as possible to go out to this pier to find Grandpa's boat. They end up going via a vehicle, but they end up crashing said vehicle and trying to make it to the pier, which ultimately they don't make it because we end up having it to where uh, the Saints men end up driving a truck to run both of them over. So Frank is to go after and find both his wife and son coincidentally going to this pier, and eventually he is just in utter just rage and sadness, yelling out for Maria, and ultimately going and finding them and holding them for a minute, but then realizing that there are people still after him. So we end up having to where Castle is to make a last stand with this shotgun, and we end up having to where these guys are pelting him with bullets, dropping one leg, dropping the other. So we end up having to ultimately Frank is just to stand there, just waiting for death. Bobby Saint is to come there and uh, to shoot him a couple times to ultimately tell him like Howard Saint sends his regards, and ultimately this time they're not blanks. So pushing on, we end up having to where Frank Castle is going to have his supposed demise by gasoline poured onto this pier of sorts. and we end up having to where ultimately Frank Castle, from this explosion, ends up being thrusted off of this pier into the water to eventually be found by the man that we had seemingly met prior, um, showcasing quite a bit or quite a little bit at this quite a little bit of a scene. So we end up having to where this guy is to otherwise revive Castle, ultimately try to fix him as much as possible, and to eventually tell him to go with God. And ultimately, Frank Castle is like, God's going to sit this one out. We end up having to where Frank Castle is to go back to ultimately going and uh, finding seemingly apartment which he can otherwise hide out on until it seems that he could ultimately go into um, surprising the Saints yet again. We end up having to ultimately Bobby, Saint, and everyone is to get the information that ultimately Frank Castle had supposedly died. Ultimately, Liv is to seduce Howard Saint because ultimately um, Howard had done what she wanted. So, pushing on, we eventually have it to where Howard Saint is to eventually go to some dance club, and we end up having to where Howard Glass ends up dancing with Liv. And it seems like ultimately Howard is consistently watching Howard Glass and Liv both dance together. And so we end up having it to where ultimately uh, that Frank is to, before he ends up really and truly doing anything with the Saints, he's ending up having to get information about them. He's ending up following them. He's ending up grabbing Mickey, the guy that we had seen in the beginning of this movie, to have him be blowtorched for information, or what he is to think is to get blowtorched for information. Told me have Mickey squeal on the Saints. Told me call Bobby Saint a putz. Ultimately to have him say that he doesn't know anything about Quentin Glass, but with a photo that is to ultimately mention that Quentin is ultimately seemingly into men, not women. So we end up having to where it seems that Howard Saint has a very predictable life, golfs, and stuff along those ways. So we eventually have it to where after Punisher's to get this information, he ends up going and ripping out his gravestone to ultimately leave uh, the gravestone where exactly Howard Saint ultimately usually ends up to be golfing, to see a gravestone that has the death date of Frank Castle to be scratched out completely. We end up having to a reasonably that they are to be told that Frank Castle is back in business, and ultimately Howard's like, yep, already got the message. So we end up having to where Howard is to ultimately say it's like, dude, we gotta get everybody on this. We gotta, like, the reason why this guy had come back to us is to die yet again, and so let's help him do that. So we end up having to ultimately seemingly Howard is not going to spare any expense to ultimately just have them eventually seemingly call the Russian. So while that is going on, we end up having it to where ultimately we end up having it to where Frank is to, or no wait, the Russian isn't the first one. We end up having a person before that. So we end up having to where ultimately Frank is to go and seemingly be a part of this apartment complex that he's in. He ends up having to seemingly meet these guys named Bumbo and ultimately Where is the other one? Sparker Dave? Dave. Anyways. We end up having to where Bumbo and Dave are to be kind of the comic relief in this movie because there's a lot of dark and brooding moments. We end up having to where Joan ultimately is a person that is seemingly going to be close to getting Frank Castle as a romantic interest, but it never really quite ends that way. Joan ultimately is ultimately the girl that ends up going and being in the X-Men movies as Mystique. The I guess uh, Hugh Jackman Wolverine. Well, that's not true because Hugh Jackman was in most of those. The Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen Mystique version. Jennifer Lawrence ended up being the other variation of that character. So, mood point. Moving on. So we end up having to where reasonably there seems to be a person trying to go and go after Joan because he is a awful ex-boyfriend of hers, and so Frank ends up helping out with that, and that ultimately makes him seemingly a part of this complex. To ultimately, they want to have like a quasi Thanksgiving thing together, which ultimately, really, and all truly, just was bizarre. So before that happens, we end up finding out that supposedly Joan is a waitress at some diner. We end up having to where ultimately Frank is to go to this diner, and Howard Heck is a assassin that ultimately ends up singing a song to dedicate to Frank Castle's funeral. And we end up having to where there's a big chase out with vehicles, and we end up having to where ultimately, no matter what Castle ends up doing, Howard Heck ends up just having seemingly a one-upsmanship going on here until the very end. We ultimately have it to where eventually Punisher ends up going and having a seemingly a knife, and Harry Heck ends up mentioning like, "Dude, you brought a knife to a gunfight." We end up finding out that seemingly this knife is a knife that shoots out like a projectile knife to go into this guy's jugular, which ultimately kills him. So that's what eventually has us roll into having seemingly uh, Punisher also going after the Howard Saints, ultimately trying to steal all their money and shooting it out onto the streets below. Ultimately, we eventually have it to where Punisher ends up going and killing some of Saint's goons, and so on and so forth. Moving on into the Russian situation. Moving on as quickly as possible. So, we end up having to eventually the Thanksgiving, or questionable Thanksgiving, had been gone on. We end up having it to ultimately uh, Dave had told Frank that supposedly there is something horribly awry going on in Joan's apartment, which ultimately was a lie. They just wanted to have dinner together. We end up having Bumbo, Joan, and Dave all going to make ice Florentine, and Frank ends up going back into his apartment to, I guess, eventually go back to have dessert. We end up having to where Frank eventually opens his door to have the Russian, which is Kevin Nash, appear at his doorstep. We end up having this very interesting fight out because we end up having it to where Frank plans for every scenario. And so we end up having it to where the Russian is outpowering the Punisher. We end up having it to where, like, Kevin Nash, the Russian, is just kind of ragdollingly flinging him around and bashing his head into this refrigerator. Like having him being thrown through a wall is a like Punisher being thrown through this wall by Kevin Nash is a really interesting image. Like just this huge, like David and Goliath, but really just like the power of Kevin Nash was just awesome in this in this scene of the Russian versus the Punisher. We end up having to where ultimately uh, the Punisher is to ultimately stab Kevin Nash, and I ended up finding out later that Kevin Nash ultimately had the story of being on the Punisher, where the knife that ultimately Punisher had been stabbed with, or Punisher had stabbed the Russian with in that movie, was not a prop knife; it was a real knife, and so Kevin Nash accidentally actually got really stabbed where he got stabbed in the movie, and he ended up just taking the blade out, and he ended up, I guess he ended up cutting, and then eventually Frank was to actually get stabbed as well with not a real knife, but we end up having to ultimately everybody's like, oh crap, like that is a real knife, and Kevin was ultimately just like, that's fine, like you know what, like so I get stitches, whatever, like dude, I'm a wrestler, like what is that gonna, who cares? So, like, that was like a really interesting thing going on there that Kevin Nash actually did really get stabbed in the movie. Sadly enough, Super Shredder, yeah, he's friggin'. Anyways, moving on. So, we end up having to ultimately, Frank Castle is to go into his bathroom and throw a grenade, and the Russian ends up batting away the grenade to go back into the bathroom. To ultimately, Frank is to run into his tub to brace himself from the explosive. This scene is so freaking amazing. Like all of this to go on here, I really get enthralled with this one scene here. Or ultimately, when I played like the Punisher video game, I think to me like the most interesting about the most interesting thing about that game is ultimately one, fighting the Russian in that game. But then also, I think the Iron Man moments in that game also is really interesting. So, moving on. So, we end up having to ultimately, the Russian is to uh, crack through the door with Punisher through Joan and Bumbo and Dave's uh, place, because this fight goes all over the place. We end up having to where Bumbo and Dave are listening to some uh, classical piece, and while that's going on, the battle's going on in their backroom window, which they're kind of seeing. They're not even seeing from a distance. So Russian and Punisher end up crashing through this door, and ultimately we have it to where Punisher ends up going and tossing a very hot pot onto the Russian. To ultimately it's like, and so we end up having to where the Russian is to back out of the entrance door, and Russian and Punisher is to basically tackle the Russian and have them fall down a flight of stairs, which ultimately kills the Russian via snapping his neck. But Punisher is very beaten up, but seemingly quasi fine. We end up seemingly having the Saints goons ending up coming after uh, Frank to ultimately see if Frank is still alive. So we end up having to where Joan ends up going and finding a secret uh, elevator part of Frank's room, and so they end up hiding there to eventually sew Frank up. While Dave and Bumbo are not giving up information to Quentin Glass about where Frank is. Um, and that scene is so interesting as well to eventually have Frank ultimately like seeing Dave like having all of his piercings pulled out one by one. He's like, dude, like you didn't have to do that for me. So Frank gets all sewed up, and immediately he goes into action mode to try and get all of the gear together while stumbling and falling. And Joan is ultimately saying, you're gonna go there to die, aren't you?" We end up having to where Punisher is saying like, "Well, there's a difference between me and them. They have something to lose." We ultimately have it to where Punisher ends up going and leaving a note before he leaves. That ultimately is a prayer that he had gotten um, from his superiors. Sic this poc parapellum. If you want peace, go to war. I think it is ultimately what the guy had said. So we ended up having it to ultimately uh, Punishers to go off to eventually go and subdue all these Howard Saint's men. We end up finding the Russians dead. So Howard Saint is basically having a room full of men that ultimately is going to be offered a boatload of money to kill Punisher, kill him till he's dead. So, which ultimately is kind of an oxymoron thing to say. So we end up having to tour one by one. The Punisher is eventually trying to sneak into this establishment that ultimately Howard Saint has. Because we end up having it to where also Howard Saint is going and seemingly uh, there are also a lot of things going on that lead us up to this moment. I think we need to get there as well. So Howard is to ultimately seemingly get a parking ticket that Mickey gives him that ultimately is a certain location at a certain date and time. We end up having to ultimately, uh, it seems like both Liv and Glass don't seem to have a really quite proper alibi. We end up having to where Punisher is orchestrating that, getting it to where supposedly Punisher is ultimately threatening Quentin of releasing photos, and ultimately Liv ultimately is just to be uh, while she is going to the movies, Punisher is going off to seemingly put together and orchestrate some affair. So we end up having a tour with this ticket ultimately at this Wyndham Motel. Ultimately, we end up having it to where Quentin is to otherwise seemingly in a masterfully craftable way figure out that seemingly Liv and Quentin are having an affair, and so ultimately we end up having it to where uh, Quentin ends up going and taking Liv to Little Cuba to ultimately throw her off onto these railroad tracks to have her be run over by a train, and we end up having it to where Howard goes to Quentin's home to move all his furniture to ultimately throw a knife in the middle of his room or into this living room to ultimately have seemingly a fight where Quentin doesn't quite understand what is to go on. So, because we end up having to where Howard eventually finds earrings that ultimately is of Liv's and in Quentin's home and so on and so forth. So we end up having to where Howard ends up going and slicing and dicing Quentin, and he's like, "Why you do this? Why you do this?" Oh, and so we end up having to where ultimately Howard ends up stabbing Quentin to ultimately have him be wrapped up in something. So we end up having it to ultimately Liv was to convince Howard that Quentin was gay, but ultimately Howard is ultimately saying like you would have said anything to not mention that you had this affair and so on and so forth. So, but in all actuality, Quentin was gay. There was evidence. So we end up having it to ultimately okay. Now we are to fast track to now be at this building that ultimately the Punisher is going to make his way through, slicing and dicing people until eventually he is to give a champagne bottle to these people that have a bomb inside of it. Once the bomb goes off, Punisher is to make his way via machine guns and double barrel shotguns and all kinds of things to make his way through all of these people, eventually to seemingly kill the one last guy that ultimately had killed his family. To where ultimately he is to basically knife this guy through the throat and all kinds of things to make his death the most horrific thing possible. We eventually have it to where seemingly we find Bobby Saint seemingly pinned, and I'm completely forgiving about uh, the guys that had otherwise lost all of their money. That end up having like cigars and talking about how they're not Cuban, they're Honduran. But that's a whole thing that ultimately I just don't want to spend the time to get into. But because we're trying to get to the ending here. So, rushing through. So, we end up having to ultimately Punishers to find Bobby Saint seemingly pinned between a bookshelf and a desk and whatever. And so we end up having to where Punisher ends up giving him a landmine that ultimately is to be tied up into a, I think, ceiling fan of sorts. And so we end up having to where ultimately Punisher mentions, like, well, hey, it looks like you work out. Ultimately gives him the landmine with an outstretched hand to see how long he's going to be able to hold it for. So we end up having to ultimately Howard Saint is to try to make his way feverishly or quickly out of this building to eventually find one of his goons, detonate some bomb. Howard Saint ends up making his way out of this building slowly but surely because it seemed like he had twisted his ankle or something along those lines. So Howard Saint is hobbling his way out of this building, and Punisher is to follow him, yelling his name, Howard Saint. So we end up having to where reasonably uh, the justification of this is that Punisher had mentioned it's like, hey, well, you killed my family. And ultimately, Howard says in kind, it's like, well, you killed my son. And then Punisher says both of them as Bobby is screaming and dying. So we end up having to ultimately that the Punisher is to get closer and closer to uh, Howard to eventually go and knock him down. We have this bizarrish like spin that ultimately John Travolta does before he falls, and we eventually have it to where uh, Punisher eventually gives him the evidence uh, of the ring that he or the earrings that he stole, the photo that shows Quentin Glass as being gay, and all the real evidence that ultimately had basically showcased that Punisher didn't have to kill Howard Saint's family. Howard Saint killed his whole entire family. So we end up having to where the last ditch effort thing to do is to ultimately have it to where uh, Punisher is to go and attach Howard Saint's leg to a car that leads into this plethora of cars that are ultimately going to explode in perfect sequence to show a Punisher skull, which ultimately is to lead to the very ending of this, to where we are going to have Punisher go off on his own to leave tons and tons of money to both uh, Joan, Bumbo, Dave. And we eventually have it to where Punisher is on some bridge somewhere with Punisher outfit on. To ultimately mention it's like those who do evil to others, psychos, sadists, will come to know me well. Uh, like Frank Castle's dead, call him Punisher, and that's where it ends. And ultimately, we get the 1, 2, 3. Like, I really loved the Marvel soundtracks of movies. Like, I really enjoyed like the Daredevil soundtrack and this Punisher soundtrack. I think I remember I ended up getting both soundtracks. I was like, yeah, 1, 2. I really enjoyed the music that was involved in both of these movies. So, if anyways, I think it's about time for me, honestly, to get out of here and ultimately say that I really like there were some interesting things going on in this movie. I like the fact that we ultimately get a Warzone movie that goes even grittier than this movie does. But reasonably, I can also just like this movie for it being simple and but effective. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.